Salutations everybody, it is Matty here today and we are talking about Wasteland 3. Now I did a poll over on my Twitter account asking you fine folks what game I should talk about next based off what I played at PAX East 2020, and the winner of that poll was, to my surprise, Destroy All Humans. But while that poll was ongoing, I was doing some research on who covered what games, and when it came to Wasteland 3 I realized that it was, pardon the pun, Barren Wasteland, and pardon the pun once more, but I'm going to break the ice here and talk about Wasteland 3 because this game was awesome based off what I had played and I really wanted to talk about it. So I don't mean to neglect the poll, we'll get to Destroy All Humans tomorrow, but for now, let's talk Wasteland 3 because Wasteland is about as Fallout as you can get. And it makes sense as to why. You see, the CEO of inXile, developers of Wasteland 3, is Brian Fargo, and he was one of the founders of Interplay, which is a company that most people who watch my channel should be familiar with, but for those who aren't, they are the company that went on to create the Fallout IP. Not Fallout 3 New Vegas, but the Fallout which was a isometric RPG, much different from what we have nowadays. Back then, funny enough, Fallout was referred to as the spiritual successor to Wasteland because Brian couldn't get the rights to continue Wasteland, so they started up the Fallout franchise. And it's funny how things come full circle because obviously Fargo's no longer involved with Fallout, so he's calling Wasteland, quote, our Fallout, end quote, in reference to inXile, and saying how they plan to support this game for years. So suffice to say, with all that information plus what I played, is that if you love some of the elements of the classic Fallout games and are seeking a modern touch, if you will, then this title should be right up your alley. Get comfortable, pay attention, this game is really fun. Now let's talk about the demo that I went hands-on with in the terms of quality, what build it was. I always want to make sure you guys are informed with what I am playing, and the demo that I played is, in the terms of levels and classes, the same that folks had access to during the alpha, which you're watching in the background right now. However, things have been a lot more polished up this time around for the show floor for PAX East. I was also told that the demo back at the home base was more polished than what I had played, so there's a bit of chain of polish here. So anything that you're seeing is from a much older build, and anything I played is from a build that is not as good as the one back at the development studio. So now with all of that out of the way, I want to start off by talking about the classes that I had access to. I'll be using descriptions provided on Gamepedia to explain them to you guys, and then talking about what gameplay differences were in place based off who I had on my team. Now keep in mind, my team and the team that you're seeing on screen is a team of 4, but you can have up to 6 Rangers with you at a time in Wasteland 3. So the first class that we're going to talk about is a basic one. It's the Trooper. Their true aim in combat, their skill with grenades and explosives, and their ability to disarm landmines all make the Trooper a Ranger you can count on to hold the line. So it pretty much describes it exactly how it is. They are really helpful in combats, they're reliable, they're steady, they don't do anything really special, but I want to talk about the disarming of landmines because it highlights a cool gameplay mechanic that has been in Wasteland before. Now this game is coming to consoles, but when I was playing on PC, there's a lot of clicking and dragging so that you can move everyone at the same time. And what happens is when you have everyone selected, let's say I go and tell my team to disarm the mines on the ground, then what actually is going to happen is that the game will recognize I'm telling the whole team to do that, and the game will individually select who's best set for that task, and then he'll go out and do it. So when I was moving around the environment and I saw a mine that I had to disable, the game would automatically select the Trooper. And I think this is great because sometimes there can be confusion with that type of stuff. Also, sometimes you may mix up your party members. It happens, and this sort of sidesteps a common issue with these types of games. After that was the combat medic. Fighting the beasts and baddies of the Wasteland, it's inevitable that a Ranger will get hurt. Combat medics are the heroes who step up into the line of fire to patch them up when they do. Whether it's suturing cuts, administering antidotes, or pulling a pal back from the brink of death, a medic keeps the team together, literally, which mine absolutely did the job. I'll get into it in a little bit, but I was pretty rusty, so I did have a teammate go down. I used my medic to revive them. They were really helpful. Obviously, based off what the title says, combat medic, they were helpful in combat. Outside of combat, they didn't have the ability to do all that much, which is why I decided personally to keep the combat medic in the back line for the majority of my time playing. Next was the sniper, another backline fighter. Call them guardian angels or angels of death. It pays to have a sniper watching you from on high. Snipers can kill your enemies before they even know what hits them, and they pride themselves on keeping their guns clean and ready to fire at all times. Yeah, so what was interesting about the sniper, and once again, this isn't anything brand new, but I quickly was reminded that if you bring them into a close range combat scenario, their aim is actually worse. So you always want to make sure that the snipers are sitting far back and away from everyone. But this was the class that I liked the least because they didn't offer any out of combat specialties. It was more so in combat. And in combat, I think that every other class really outperformed the sniper, at least in my scenario. Lastly was the hobo. Now the hobo does not have a description available online, but essentially every class has their own set of abilities. The survivalist will allow you to charm and tame beasts out in the wild and have them fight for you in combat, which can be really awesome. The hobo has the ability to drink certain items and get buffs slash debuffs depending on the scenario and what you're drinking. So there's a lot that goes into these classes, which is why I personally sit on the side of thinking that the sniper was the worst of the four I had experienced. Meanwhile, the hobo was running around drunk as hell with a shotgun in hand. It was really funny in a manner of speaking, especially some of the dialogue you hear from the hobo. Anyway, I think the classes are going to provide a lot of choice and gameplay variation because of the abilities that they do provide, but also on top of that, some of the out of combat scenarios that each class is proficient with. There was one terminal I had stumbled upon where I needed a perk or a skill called nerd stuff at, I believe it was level 9. I did not have that, so I did not have access to the terminal, and quite frankly, I don't know what that terminal held in it, whether it was lore or a way to navigate the level differently. I thought that it would have been really helpful to have something like that, but I didn't. So it's going to be interesting to go back and maybe on my first official playthrough of Wasteland 3, when I have the full game, I can figure out what that is, and I'll have a different experience from someone else who may not build their class that way. Now, like I said, Wasteland is a lot like the older Fallout games. That means that there's a lot more role-playing involved, and I want to talk about the one choice I was able to make throughout this demo. Although I was not able to see the repercussions, it was explained to me, and I want to relay that info to you. So I was deciding the fate of a character. I could have arrested him and said, you know what, nope, you're coming with us. I could have had him join my team and been one of the Rangers, or I could have teamed up with him and joined his side of things and made people fear us more. But what one of the representatives of inXile told me and made sure to stress to me is that the choices that you can make would alter over 1,000 lines of dialogue at this point in time. And I don't think every choice will be this dramatic at every point in the game, but I think it goes to show how impactful a major choice can be, right? 1,000 lines of dialogue in game development is not cheap, folks. It's not just, chump change that you just stumble upon. That's a lot of resources that you are essentially saying we can forsake this in exchange for choice. It's why there was a major issue leading into the early 2010s where choice and consequence in games became more of an illusion rather than prevalent player agency, and why when I heard that, it was music to my ears. I may not ever hear all 1,000 of those dialogue lines, and I'm happy as hell that I am not forced to, and that I can have a decision based on my experience, and if I like a character, I can keep them or I can get rid of them, and that has a significant change on my game, and that when you do that, maybe you take a different path, and because of that, you have a different experience. So when we trade stories, it's one of those awesome moments as a gamer. That same member of inXile also went on to tell me how Microsoft's acquisition of them enabled them to push the game even further in a way that I think is to be expected nowadays. But with those 1,000 lines of dialogue, you think they'd be, I don't know, a little more stingy. Originally, the title was only going to feature a few voiced characters at most, but now they have the entire game fully voiced, which absolutely brings in some personality. Like I mentioned, the hobo, he was making me laugh the whole entire demo. So stuff like that would not have been as prevalent if it were not for the Microsoft acquisition. You could also see some resources being invested into motion capture and animation. However, the quality of those is in question for me personally, so we'll get into that towards the end of the video. Let's talk about difficulty, because Wasteland 2 is, in my opinion, a nice, strong difficulty, but then towards the end, there is this gigantic power curve and you really get your butt beat. It's something with these types of games, right? Because funny enough, Larian Studios does it with the final act in Divinity Original Sin 2. Everything's fine, it's a great challenge, and suddenly everything kicks up to 5,000. Now, it doesn't help that it's been a while since I've played a Wasteland game, so it took some getting used to. I had to relearn the controls. So at first, my positioning and strategies of approach were, I'm gonna be honest, they were pretty poor, and I was punished for it. I quickly ran out of med kits and was also reminded of how precious resource balancing is to this franchise, and it's one of the things that makes Wasteland so great, because you can have 100 bullets on you and be like, man, I'm balling out, but all of a sudden you get into a combat scenario, you got 20 bullets left and you think to yourself, oh boy, now I'm in trouble if I get into another fight. And there's that stretch to find a little bit more resources to do something to help yourself out. And while this may be old news for folks if you played prior Wasteland games, I was personally happy to learn that a lot of what makes the series special and what I had liked about prior entries had been retained even when I had forgot about them and I hopped back in and said, ah, right, this was here in this series. So it doesn't seem like the Microsoft acquisition, the extra money, the attempts to maybe make the game a much higher budget title have hurt it whatsoever, and they've managed to retain some of those great elements of Wasteland. Combat sessions, however, once I got into the swing of things, were relatively quick. Most of the enemies I fought were squishy, so a few shots were all it took. Now keep in mind, I think maybe the classes and the characters I were playing as were a really strong bunch, we'll say. I was also unaware of what difficulty I was playing on, so that could play a factor, but pretty much anytime I got a couple shots in on an enemy, they were dead. However, there were times I got crafty and it felt great. There was one time that I had my precision shot ability available for my trooper during the final fight of the demo. The main enemy I was focusing on had a fire tank on his back, so naturally I'm like, yep, we're going for that. I had a 50% chance of hitting it. I hit the tank on his back, blew it up. There was fire everywhere. He was severely wounded, making the fight a little bit easier. And I just loved how I was able to exploit an ability specifically on one class and take out a weak point on an enemy. That was a really powerful moment there. And I think as you start to crank up the difficulty and you start to get deeper into the game, those types of moments are only going to become more and more powerful for the player. One kind of underrated aspect that I loved about this game was how looting worked. Since there was a lot of clicking and dragging and team movement, it would have been a pain in the ass if I had to move them all around across areas and loot each body individually. Fortunately, Wasteland 3 does something that you kind of see in MMOs, where when you loot one body, it targets a larger area. And so when the looting begins, some of the items I acquired were all the way across the arena that I had just fought in, but I was able to just quickly get them and continue moving on. And those items, by the way, were awesome. I got a heavy nuclear style of armor that pretty much reminded me of power armor instantly. I was impervious to most damage. Normal bullets were doing 1 to 2 damage, but on the other side, I hardly had any mobility. I put it on my trooper to see how it would work, but it did not pan out in my favor, so I decided to just take that off. But the idea that you could make your team into human tanks was so cool. I found heavy laser weaponry, but sadly didn't have the laser cells to make use of it, something that may also sound familiar to Wasteland vets. Now, I don't really think I've ever said this about an isometric game, but it's really a looker. It's hard to make harsh snowfall a thing of beauty without it getting in the way of the player, especially when the camera is overhead, right? In something like Horizon Zero Dawn, you can argue that the snow is a big part of the game, and it makes it so beautiful because you can see Aloy's tracks in the snow. But in this time, it's a very hard snowfall. So I think it's the combination of effective lighting, like the headlights of your vehicle piercing through the snow and seeing it a little more intensely in those cones of lights, alongside a sense of surviving tough conditions that really identifies with the series, combining to create a unique feeling atmosphere. I noted that when I moved the camera around to see the environments or to see what enemies were up to, that the snow would fade out a little bit to make sure the player had clarity. It's a minor touch, but a really smart one at that. So overall, I really liked a lot of what I played about this game, but what didn't I like? Well, number one, like I said, once I got into the swing of things, it was a little easier to kill enemies, and that may have been just because of the sake of the build. They wanted to make sure players were quickly getting through this demo so more people online could hop in and play Wasteland 3. I would imagine that was more so the case, but I think balance is something that's so important with these titles, not only in the terms of resource management, making sure you have enough on you, but also the power curve toward the later game and making sure you're not stomping things too early on. It can quickly become a frustrating or boring experience, so it has to be tuned just right. Also, some of the animations during conversation were really wacky looking. I mean, it's something I imagine will be sharpened up by launch, but as it stands now, they're almost so animated that they look like puppets. It's really goofy looking. They're rolling their head around and they're popping their eyes out. It's really not the fun type of goofy where you're like, oh, it's Wasteland, oh, dark humor. It's like, no, they just look really weird. So that's really the only major thing that stuck out to me. Outside of that, I was really pleased with my time with Wasteland 3, and if you're a Fallout fan, this game really should be on your radar. It's coming out in May, and it's looking really good. So are you interested in Wasteland 3 now? Were you already interested? Let me know what you think of all of this in the comments down below. I'm looking forward to seeing your thoughts. Other than that, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. Those links are in the description down below, along with my Patreon. Do consider supporting that as it fuels all the content I create here. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.